Hi, I'm honored to introduce Gavin Grounds. He leads the cybersecurity strategy and enterprise information risk at Verizon as part of the leadership team in corporate information security organization. As you probably know, Verizon is a Fortune 20 company with revenues over 130 billion and assets approaching 300 billion. They have several divisions: Verizon Consumer Group, the Business Group, the Media Group, and others. Solutions include 5G, 4G LTE, network services, communication services, video, data services, managed services, even Internet of Things. In his leadership role, he's basically ensuring that Verizon's information assets are adequately protected and that Verizon's policies, legal, regulatory, and governance requirements are being met. Prior to joining Verizon, Gavin was Senior Director, Information Security Risk and Compliance at DXC. DXC was formed as a spin-out from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and combined with Computer Sciences Corporation. There he was the Global Director, Information Risk Management Enterprise Security Services, leading an organization of 1,800 security and compliance professionals. He's also been in leadership roles at the world's largest financial services, energy manufacturing companies, CIO of an outsourcing company, founder and CEO of a security consulting company, a leadership role at a founder of a software company. He serves as an advisory board position at cybersecurity software companies. He's a member of IoT European Council, fellow at BCS, and is currently the chairman of the USA Section Chartered Institute for IT. Gavin is also an author of several international and US patents and patent pending applications, one of which is System and Methods for Automated Quantitative Risk and Threat Calculations and Remediation, which should be very pertinent to today's session. Gavin was born and educated in the UK, has lived in Europe, Asia, Americas, currently living in the USA. In his private time, he's not busy enough, so he's a musician. He races motor cars, and in the past 15 months has run 4 half marathons and 4 full marathons. In addition, he's a fundraiser for various charities, from benefiting children, suicide prevention, and preventing extreme poverty. So Gavin, I'm excited to hear your presentation on quantification of risk. Over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Mike. Great to be here. And hey, Mike, I do have a challenge for you and your team, and that is the award just a few minutes ago for the Selfie Award. I was actually going for who can have the most laptops on the desk award. So what I would like to do though is the prize for that award. I'm going to challenge you and your team to come up with another competition in the next 2 days, and give that award to whoever wins that competition that you guys put on the table. So, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Very good.
All right. So yeah, we have a lot to talk about today, but specifically around the quantification of cyber risk in particular. And so really what I wanted to do is just cover 3 specific areas today. One is really just just kind of highlighting some of the limitations that I think we're all familiar with when it comes to dealing with cyber risk in a qualitative fashion. And then secondly, there are a number of models out there which we've also used that make strides towards the quantification of cyber risk, and specifically putting cyber risk into dollars and cents. A lot of the current models, though, still have some challenges in terms of scale and business value. So we'll talk about what some of those challenges are. And then finally, we'll talk about really how we can get to a more comprehensive cyber risk quantification methodology that is scalable and that does speak in business terms in the business vernacular. So if we get straight into the qualitative view, first of all, I think we're all probably very familiar with this kind of view. When we think about cybersecurity risk or information risk in general, it's probably one of the areas of business where we very quickly move away from talking in numbers, dollars, and cents and start talking in grades and colors. So it's low, medium, high, critical, or green. And you probably heard me, use this analogy previously. It's one of the favorite ones that I've heard, and that is, when we say, for example, if we're considering a life decision, like a new job, and if at the final stages somebody says to us, hey, the salary is awesome, I would rate it high. What about the healthcare benefits? Well, yeah, they're kind of medium high, and the STI and short-term and long-term incentives, oh, critical high. It's very few make a career decision based on that, because we literally want to know what are the incentives. Am I going to be able to pay my mortgage? Am I going to be able to pay for college and tuition, whatever the case might be? And yet, when it comes to cyber risk, we tend to immediately and invariably talk about low, medium, high, critical, red, amber, green. And what I've highlighted here just on the chart is just an example. And on the left-hand side, by the way, with CVEs, those are real CVEs and with the real CVSS ratings. On the right-hand side is just example data. And really what we're kind of highlighting here is when we think about a vulnerability in the environment and then try to convert that into risk, we might first look at the CIA rating, criticality, impact, and availability. But when we look at that through the lens only of a vulnerability, then what we're missing is the business context. So even between the C, the I, and the A, which is more important to the business? Is it the confidentiality that's more important? Is it the availability that's more important? And so even there, within that small kind of triangle, we start to see issues around the quantification of that risk. And equally, obviously, the CIA is affected by the context in which the application of the platform where that vulnerability might show up. So what we're showing on the right-hand side is basically where we have ambiguity. We might have a CVSS rating that puts it up in somewhere in the 4 or 5 range. And when we look at how prolific that is in the environment, from platforms that are doing everything from generating revenue to collecting cash to managing the menu in the cafeteria, the impact is going to be different. And so we start to see ambiguity. And that's just in the small lens of a vulnerability and how we try to translate that into a business risk. When we then think about how then that applies more to the business risk, what we can kind of see here is we look at all of these factors that really do affect risk and business risk in the context of cybersecurity and information risk. So as an example, we just talked a little bit about the vulnerability view. And on the top right-hand corner, you can see we did an effort to try and make it more process-centric so that we can take some business context into the equation there when we're talking about the risk to the business. But there's so many other facets that affect the impact and the criticality and the importance, essentially, of those situations or those vulnerabilities in the context of business risk. So, for example, we could look to the very bottom left, the architecture. So when we think about the architecture, there are specific aspects about the architecture and the design of the environment that will affect the risk, and that will actually affect the relevance of, for example, a vulnerability. So whether the system is made with multiple entries into third parties, do we have APIs in there? Are they bidirectional, unidirectional? Are they pushing data, pulling data, pushing instructions, accepting instructions? And then we think about an environment where we're completely in a software-defined environment. So it could be a software-defined network, software-defined data centers, essentially. And so all those architectural aspects have a huge relevance to the materiality of a vulnerability, and when we're trying to put that in the context of risk. Then, of course, we have other areas such as the threat intel. So when we're looking at the threat landscape, it's interesting, even when we think about what do we define as a threat. And in cybersecurity, it would be excused to think immediately of, hackers, nation state actors, and the proliferation of all the various different methods that we see, including ransomware and so on. But also when we think about the threat, really the threat is anything that presents a material risk to our business. So in the context of information risk and cyber risk, there are so many things that actually present a threat to our business, not least of which, by the way, would be compliance. So we have certain regulatory requirements that we need to comply with. So conceptually rather, we could even think about a regulator as being a threat actor, because if there is material risk to our business, if there's a regulation that we need to comply with and that we're not being compliant, we're not able to comply, or we're not systemically and sustainably compliant with those requirements. So that presents a threat to the business. And then, of course, we have all of the other aspects around information and IT, whether it's open source vulnerabilities and so on. So with all of these areas, when we're talking about low, medium, high, red, amber, green, or low, medium, high, critical, how do we put all of those into the context of each other in a qualitative fashion and talk about business risk? And that is really one of the major challenges that I think we've all faced as a community when it comes to information risk management and cyber risk. So that really makes the case for quantification. As mentioned in the opening comments there are a number of models where we make an effort, if you like, to go down this track or down on the journey of quantification of cyber risk and information risk, specifically taking cyber risk and information risk and trying to put it into business vernacular. You know, for example, trying to land on what an ALE might actually be, an annualized loss expectancy, you know, converting into dollars, cents, pounds and pence, euros, centimos, you know, pick your currency, but, you know, whichever way we can represent that. But there are some challenges, even with the models today, that are available when we start to think about how we can quantify information risk and cyber risk in the context of business and dollars and cents. And part of that is the problem we talked about earlier, and it's the scalability challenge. You know, we have all this plethora of information, all this data around us when it comes to information and cyber and cyber security controls and so on, that when we then try to calculate those into some kind of monetary risk, we immediately have a scale issue. And also we have the complexities between vulnerabilities. And of course, if we come from an IT background, we might immediately start thinking about vulnerabilities in the operating system or in code. But really, when we think about a vulnerability, you know, oftentimes we will use that interchangeably with susceptibility. In other words, if there's a threat or an issue, how susceptible are we to that issue? Because that becomes relevant when it comes to quantifying the risk. So part of the challenge with the quantification models that we see to date are really because of that scale, because of the challenge of bringing all of that information together. We almost have to become qualitative to begin with. So, for example, if we have a quantification initiative and it starts off with something to the effect of, you know, what are your top 5 risks? Then we're already challenged when it comes to quantification, because the question in of itself is a qualitative question. You know, so we're basically saying, what's your gut feel? What are the things that you're most worried about? And so whilst we think we might know what our top 5 risks are in that example, really the first risk, you can ask that question, what are the top 5 risks? Because invariably what we find is a lot of the risks are risks that we're not aware of, or risks that we are aware of, but we're struggling to measure. I would say measure is it actually gets to visibility. Specific example is I was reading an article recently and it talks about how, you know, one of the risks and challenges is not whether we have the technology in place to provide controls, but is how well configured those elements of technology are in the first place. And so there we have a risk, if you like, because of which is to do with procedures and configurations. And so it's incredibly difficult to take those and say, well, now put that into answer the question, what are your top 5 risks? Because in answering that question, we might assume that those we have in place are effective. And yet the real question is, how effective are the measures that we put in place to measure the effectiveness of those controls? You know, so for example, if we're reliant heavily on audit reviews, which are invariably sample-based, then we're already flawed in the confidence that we can have in how effective our controls are in the first place. And the other key thing, I think, in terms of some of the quantitative models that are there today, is a lot of them are rear view mirror based. In other words, when we think about, we're asked the question, what's the probability or what's the likelihood? And oftentimes we'll be, or invariably we'll look at, well, how many times has it happened in the last year? How many times has it happened in the last 3 years? How many times in the last 5 years? So we're using that retrospective view as part of an actual mathematical calculation to try to predict what the future likelihood would be. Now, by the way, any model that we've seen out there that use that method to predict the likelihood of a global pandemic that would shut down countries and businesses for months on end, we probably would not have put that as a relatively high probability or likelihood based on that rear view mirror look. So I think it's one of the key things when we think about risk quantification is that rear view mirror perspective does not define what will come in the future. Well, the real question is then, you know, can we define what will come in the future, or can we be more prescriptive and perhaps more accurate around what could come in the future based on what we actually do know? And that's really what I'm going to spend the last section of this presentation just walking through, is how we can land on a comprehensive quantification model around cyber that does take all of that contextual information into the equation, if you like. You know, the architecture, the business value, the vulnerabilities, the threats, how we can literally quantify based on what we do know. And then as those things change, be able to do a predictive model that says where our true risks are starting to emerge, and then even do some modeling so we can try to predict if certain events might change our view and conclusions in terms of what risks are the highest value. So one of the phrases that I really do like in this context, so we think of it as if you're a CISO or if you're a risk officer or if you're a practitioner in this space, is how do we get to that? How do we get to the view where based on all of the perhaps complexity of our environment, and particularly in information risk and cyber risk, how do we get to that model? And I think one of the key things that I like and what I've learned from this is the phrase, go to war with what you have. So in other words, we are where we are. And so, if we think that there's going to be some magical tool that we can go and buy and just install, and now, hey, guess what? We're doing quantitative risk and it's business aligned and it's predictive, then we're not going to get there. So what we need to do as a practitioner, as a CISO, as a leader, is to go to war with what we have. For example, just think about this as a rhetorical question. In your environment, how many logs are you collecting every day across your environment? Whether it's cloud-based services, whether it's X as a service, whether it's legacy IT infrastructure, network infrastructure, how many logs are you? And then with those logs, what are we doing with them? Are we analyzing, for example, in a SIM model where we're looking for a particular pattern that we can then trigger an event on? Are we looking at them in the context of business and what the business value is to those particular assets that we're looking to protect? So in other words, when we take inventory of what we have in place today, what we actually can know and what we do know is really where to start. I think the other really important thing is putting that into the context of not just IT, not just information services, and not just technology and cyber, but also in terms of other changing around the business. I mean, we've heard a few times already on the sessions today around obviously the current pandemic response. Really, the pandemic response has become a pressure test on our controls and processes already. So, the pressure test, for example, to see how effective are our controls that we have already in place. If we have a volumetric increase, for example, in the number of remote connections or remote workers, that's the pressure test. It's just the volume test of those controls that are already in place. But are we measuring those? Are we truly capturing and taking advantage of the performance indicators that we have from those controls? And the other thing is, how relevant are those controls to the business problem that we're trying to solve? And so that's what, those are all elements of data and information and assets that we have access to today. So what I wanted to do is just spend a little bit of time just to share with you the way we've actually accomplished this. So what you can basically see on the left-hand side is really a representation of some of the key blocks, if you like, some of those core sources of information that we have from our various applications and various services that we have already in place. And you'll see some of them are highlighted that we talked about earlier: data classification, the criticality in the context of business, and also the assets. When we think about assets, we think even a process is an asset. Anything that produces value to the company is an asset. And so when we put it into that context, then what we did is basically took all of the information around what we do know and put that into an algorithm. So basically what that means, literally as we're talking today, is in the last 24 hours or so, we've collected between 1.2 and 1.3 billion pieces of data that relate in some form or fashion to those boxes on the left-hand side. And through a quantification methodology and also a calibration where we kind of put the relevance of each of those pieces of information, how relevant they are to each other, how dependent or interdependent they are on each other, and how they relate to the actual business value that they're actually producing or protecting. That's what I mean by calibration. Through that risk engine, we are literally scoring every single app and every single service with a risk currency. Now, if you attended the conference last year, you heard me talk about the concept of risk currency. And that's really thinking about risk and information risk in particular and cyber risk in the context of its own currency. Just basically think about like a item. So therefore, every application, based on what that application does for a living, how exposed that application is, how dependent we are as a business on that particular application. Is it generating revenue? Is it collecting cash? Is it running the cafeteria menu? You see, all those aspects feature into the risk score, along with vulnerabilities that we see across the environment, but also the compensating controls or the offset controls for those vulnerabilities. And literally, as they change over time, hour to hour, minute to minute, day to day, and so on. And so what that does for us is it produces a risk score based on specific services and the way the risk is operating or changing in the operating environment of our information services. And of course, then on the right-hand side, you can see we go through the typical model of once we've identified the risk, we've now actually quantified it in terms of operational risk. Now we can actually quantify it in terms of dollars, cents, pounds and pence, euros and centimos, and whichever other currency you choose. But from that, you can see how it features into all of the things. So our transformation strategies, our secure system development lifecycle management plans, and so on, which then that feeds right back into the overall operating environment. So that's just a quick snapshot on the challenges that we all face today around a qualitative based view of cybersecurity and information risk, the benefits, but some of the challenges around scale and scalability through some of the quantification models to try to turn that into a dollars and cents annualized loss expectancy, but the reality of what we could and should be doing around the quantification of operating IT risk, operating information risk, operating cyber risk. So I guess some of the key takeaways that I would like to leave you with on this is first of all, when we think about quantification of risk, the rear view mirror does not define the way forward. The rear view mirror is an interesting perspective and a useful perspective, but it's not the exclusive perspective. But really putting the business or putting cybersecurity risk and information risk into the context of the business value is what really helps us then to start defining what the way forward could look like and should look like. And the final thing is that I'd just like to leave you with on this is, perfection is the enemy of progress. So, I would encourage everybody to work with what you do have and work with what you do know and absolutely capitalize on what you do know. Then improve based on what you could know and always aspire to what you should know. And that cycle will allow us to deliver value to the business in terms of cybersecurity risk and cybersecurity forecasting, as well as to continuously improve business changes and the environment changes. So with that, Mike, back to you for any Q&A.
Thank you, Gavin. So first question, in the new normal, it's, organizations have come to realize that the unexpected will occur. So can risk quantification give you a glimpse into the future, before these things actually occur?
Yeah, I think it can do, Mike, and it has to. You think about some of the risk models when we talk about the rear view mirror or even a probability. Sometimes we might be tempted to try to calculate a probability, but when it comes to cyber risk and information risk, this is more than just trying to play a two-deck poker game and trying to predict what cards are going to come next, or because that's kind of probability based, or playing roulette. If our approach is purely rear view mirror and kind of mathematical in that sense, then we literally are gambling. That's kind of the essence of gambling. But when we take what we do know about the operating environment, we're monitoring how threats are developing, how system usage is changing, how the demands of the business are changing. As we coalesce that together, then it is possible through quantification to be able to start to do predictive models so we can see where our investments are best made and when.
Okay. Well, it seems to me one of the major challenges that a CISO faces is getting the board of directors involved and basically responsive to your cybersecurity plan. What role does quantification of risk play in that? What's your advice to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, I think there's really two things, Mike. I think, historically and traditionally, if we go back far enough, security was always an afterthought. and was oftentimes viewed as a kind of a necessary evil when it comes to expense. I think the whole profession has clearly changed over the last several years, and there's true business value recognized from the whole kind of CISO office and from the information risk office. But I think quantification, while we're still in this place where we talk about low, medium, high, critical, it's going to be difficult to convert that into a business conversation. And the reason why I mentioned historically is, sometimes we feel like we have to defend why we're spending such and such on security. I think with the approach, what it allows us to do is to defend sometimes why we're not spending. And say, hey, we actually don't want to spend as much in this area. What we really do want to spend is on this area, but here's the business reason why. I think when we can tie that to literally to the to the balance sheet, to the P&L and the cash flow of the company, then it's a much easier conversation to have with the board and the C-suite.
So cyber quantification is an effective component, an important component of integrated risk management, but it still seems like the adoption is slow or low. What are the top 3 things that a CISO can do to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things, Mike. I think first of all, I mentioned it earlier about perfection is the enemy of progress. So I think to very quickly work with what we do know and what we can know about the operating environment, but then to map that truly to the business. So, for example, as a CISO or an information risk officer or anyone kind of in that organization, we need to be able to answer the question, first of all, what are the priorities of the business? In other words, do we really know which parts of the business are producing revenue, which are producing the margins and the profits, which are producing cash flow? And also then strategically, what's most important to the company? Are we going on a CapEx spend? Are we going on an OpEx spend? I mean, those are all business questions. And really the whole role of information risk management, information security and cyber and the whole office of the CISO is to defend and enable. So I think to first of all, make sure that all of our leadership staff, all of our team truly understand the business of our businesses. And from that, then we can then start to map the value of what we already do and what we already do know, and start to flush out and make those connections, if you like, of which ones are providing the biggest value.
Okay. And then last question for me, what is your primary objective for your initiative, and how do you see MetricStream helping you to accomplish your objectives?
Okay, so I'll break that into two, Mike. So I think the first one I've kind of partially answered. I mean, for us, as the office of the CISO, when we're dealing with information risk, it's all about being aligned with the corporate strategic imperatives. So it's not only about what our business and our businesses, frankly, is doing today, but what are those strategic imperatives, the direction that each of our businesses headed in, because that's really what's going to be driving value to all of our stakeholders. So for me, it was about making sure that the cybersecurity strategy and our information risk strategy can map to all of our corporate imperatives. And frankly, if it can't map to a corporate imperative, then I have to ask the question, then why are we doing it? Because each element must be able to map back to the business value. So that was that is rather a big part of it. And of course, baked into that is the defend strategy. How the office of the CISO and information risk management, that we can actually defend our existing business and therefore facilitate those strategic activities. With MetricStream specifically, one of the things that we're driving for, Mike, is we're not looking for a tool. We're not looking for a GRC tool. I think that's often, especially a corporation and a company the size of ours, it's almost foolhardy to think there's just one magical tool that's going to solve everything for us. For us, the value is that we are a business of businesses. We have compliance requirements in our field operations that to do with how we lay cable, how we run cable. We have compliance requirements in our financial operations. We have compliance requirements in our enterprise services. Name the business, we have compliance requirements, and we have risk. And the view of compliance and the view of risk needs to be different in each of those domains. So what we're looking for with the platform with MetricStream is really to allow us to tap into, to integrate all of those various sources of information in a bi-directional fashion. So really what we can build out to, and what's absolutely critical, is building to really contribute and drive the full ERM, the enterprise risk management. And especially in cyber risk and information risk, we must be able to plug into, and therefore be one of the domains that drives the whole enterprise risk management play, because that's where the value is to the business. So that's what we're looking for specifically in terms of the MetricStream technology.
Okay. And then a couple questions from the audience. One, are there common domain information or data sets that are available that could be accessed with costing from recent cyber incursions? I'm thinking, for example, from the recent weaknesses detected in Zoom, could this give us some risk indicators or weightings to use?
Yeah, I think with those, especially where there's a lot of studies out there that say, what the average cost of a breach is, or the example you just gave is the potential from a specific vulnerability in any given platform. So I think those studies are very useful in terms of an order of magnitude perspective. But obviously, what we need to do is we need to essentially bring that home. In other words, for our specific company or organization, and then the specific divisions and/or business units within that, we need to literally translate to what does that mean to us. So, as an example, Mike, in the question, they use the example of Zoom. Well, if we're not using Zoom, then that's pretty low risk for us, right? If we're using it prolifically, then it's a different model. That's what I mean by bringing it home. So I think those studies are useful, again, from an order of magnitude perspective, whether it's, that one, or whether it's, the average cost of a breach, or whatever the case might be. But I think it's absolutely necessary for us to put that in the context of our own business of businesses, and then we can really be more prescriptive about the business value.
Got it. We have many more questions coming in, but I'm sorry we're out of time. Thank you very much